Thanks for bringing your attention up here. Appreciate it. My name's Tom Anderson. I'm the Executive Director at Wealth Management at Morgan Stanley. I'm delighted to have the privilege to introduce Mr. Axelrod to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs today. It is an outstanding opportunity and for all of us to hear his perspective, and it's an honor for me to be here this afternoon. David and I had a chance to visit. You might be surprised to know that we have a tremendous amount in common. It turns out that he has a Labradoodle. I have a Golden Doodle. We enjoy actually taking our dogs to the exact same park. It turns out that I'm a University of Chicago alum. He's a University of Chicago alum. Some differences start a little bit in our history. He had a book come out in February, and that book has been critically acclaimed by people like David Gergen in the New York Times, George Stephanopoulos. You've had The Economist. I mean, this is really out there. I had a book come out in March. It has been critically acclaimed by my wife, a couple high school buddies, and my kids think it's pretty cool too. So, we also owe a lot to the great state of Iowa. That's where David got a lot of his start and spent a lot of time in Iowa with President Barack Obama, and that led President Barack Obama going to the White House. I'm actually from Iowa, and I grew up in a White House. So, in all seriousness, Winston Churchill famously said that democracy is the worst form of government except all others that have been tried. He also said that politics is the ability to foretell what's going to happen tomorrow, next week, next month, and next year, and to have the ability afterwards to explain why it didn't happen. Sounds to me like politics also has a lot to do with stock market strategists as well. Indeed, democracy and politics can be messy. And as an increasing number of presidential hopefuls set out on the campaign trail for 2016 presidential election, this is a particularly appropriate time to reflect on the American political process. And it begs the question, can one remain optimistic about American democracy after 40 years in politics? Mr. David Axelrod is a veteran strategist and has spent decades working on political campaigns from the local level to the White House and has helped to elect some of the most influential leaders in recent decades. Throughout his career, he has witnessed the turmoil and progress and many successes, but also failure. Nevertheless, in his recent book, Believer, My 40 Years in Politics, Mr. Axelrod shows that politics can still be a calling and not a business. Today, I look forward to hearing his stories and insights from 4 decades he spent in the corridors of power. Although he hardly needs an introduction, allow me to take a moment to provide some background on today's speaker. Mr. David Axelrod is the director of the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago, a nonpartisan institute that he founded in 2013. Designed to inspire students and to pursue political careers in politics and public service. As a political consultant, he has managed media and communication strategy for more than 150 state, local, and national campaigns. He has served as a senior strategist to President Obama's successful re-election campaign. He also served in that same role for then Senator Obama's 2008 presidential campaign before going on to serve in the White House as a senior advisor to the president. Prior to becoming a political consultant, Axelrod spent 8 years as a reporter and columnist at the Chicago Tribune, including a stint at City Hall as a bureau chief. Now, I have to tell you, David, that we have some unfortunate news for you that is hot off the press. Bob Zimmer, who is the president of the University of Chicago, just actually was on the phone with King Harris, who is a trustee at the university. And it turns out that some of the factual information within the book has been called into question. They are concerned if you actually did pass the swimming test and you've been called to the University of Chicago pool for 3 o'clock this afternoon. So thank you very much. It's an honor to welcome you today.
Thanks, Tim. For those of you who haven't read the book, if you do, you'll understand the swimming story, but after a prodigious effort to graduate in time at the University of Chicago, I almost was disqualified because it turns out I hadn't passed my freshman swimming test. So a searing memory that I carry with me still. Tim, thank you very much. It was fun to chat with you and to compare notes about our dogs. And it's great to be here. I really appreciate all of you being here. I want to say a word about this organization, which is a great institution in our city, and my friend Ivo Dalder has made it an even greater institution in this city. Ivo is someone that I met when he was in his official role and I was in mine, and he was the ambassador to NATO. And he struck me right away as the kind of person that I most appreciate in public life, people who take what they do seriously but don't take themselves too seriously. And that's a great quality, and he's got it in abundance, and we're lucky to have him here in Chicago, so give him a hand. I would be remiss if I didn't mention an old colleague of mine sitting here who you all know, Dick Longworth. When I came to the Tribune, Dick had just come to the paper. They had recruited him from what, UPI, is that where you were? You were the Moscow bureau chief, is that? And Dick was legendary because he was so smart and such a good reporter and such a great writer that every reporter in that newsroom aspired to be like Dick Longworth. And you are lucky to have him involved with your activities as well. As Tim mentioned, my role now is as director of the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago, something of which I'm proud every single day. And we've got a delegation here from the university, and we have 5 of our fellows who come and spend a quarter or part of a quarter with us doing seminars and mentoring our students, and I just want to say a word about them. First of all, Senator Mark Udall is here, who is just joining us and his wife Maggie, and we're so pleased that you're going to be with us. Genevieve Wood is a senior contributor. What do you call yourself? To the Daily Signal, which is affiliated with the Heritage Foundation. LZ Granderson writes about sports, and particularly the intersection between sports and society for ESPN. Kate Grossman, may be known to some of you as the deputy editorial page editor of the Chicago Sun-Times, who's doing this quarter talking about education reform. She covered education for 20 years. And Suat, I'm going to try and say your name. I hope that you'll forgive me for what just is about to happen. But why don't you say your last name? All right, I'm glad you did it and not me. Suat was a member of the parliament in Turkey and is a sensational person who's been with us, and what better time, given events in that region and in that country, to have a fellow from Turkey. So I am grateful to all of you. We're having a wonderful quarter, and you represent what the IOP is all about. So thank you for that. Thank you for being here. And thanks to Steve Edwards, our great executive director, who many of you know. I still get yelled at for taking him off of WBEZ radio. I'm gonna try and talk briefly. I'm talking about a book that's a memoir, so it's easy for me to get off on flights of fancy here. But I want to leave some time for questions about anything you have in mind, and including the British elections, in which I painfully was just involved. In fact, maybe I should talk a little longer. I don't know. But Tim's right. I wanted the subtitle of this book to be How My Idealism Survived 40 Years in Politics. That's really what this book is about. And my interest actually goes back beyond 40 years. It goes back to when I was 5 years old. And it goes back to a particular date. A lot of people can't find the particular time and moment when a lifelong interest and passion began, but mine began on October 27th, 1960. And that was the day that John F. Kennedy came to my community in New York City campaigning for president. He was the senator from Massachusetts, Democratic nominee. It shows you how long ago it was that a Democrat was campaigning in New York City 10 days before the election. But New York was actually in doubt then. New York was a swing state at the time. And he was doing 10 stops in New York City that day. And one of them was Stuyvesant Town, where I grew up, which was a housing development that was built for returning war veterans on the east side of Manhattan. And the woman who took care of me when I was when my mother was at work. This wonderful African-American woman named Jessie Berry, who was kind of your classic story, came up in the Great Migration. She had very little formal education and lots of wisdom, and she thought this would be important for me to see. And she took me out to 20th Street, which is a big boulevard where Stuyvesant Town is, on the east side, right by the river. And she put me on top of a mailbox so I could see. And I watched 20th Street fill in. Normally it was just bustling with cars. Now it was filled in with people. And then this very charismatic, young, red-haired guy jumped up on a platform and started talking, and his voice was booming off of the buildings, and everybody was listening with rapt attention. And it was clear that something really important was happening here. And what he said that day was, and I should point out, I didn't really remember what he said that day. I was 5. I was precocious, but that would have been a little much. But through the wonders of Google, which nobody there could have imagined that day, I was able to find the speech that he gave that day. And what he said was, I'm not here on the platform that says if you elect me, everything will be good. He said being an American citizen in the 1960s is a hazardous occupation filled with peril, but also hope. And we'll choose which path we take. And I don't know what of that I absorbed, but that statement really encapsulates my view of what politics is all about. It's about how we grab the wheel of history and turn it, often ever so slightly, but in the direction that we want to lead. That we're not simply flotsam on the waters of history, but we can row and we can determine the quality of our future. His brother Robert said it even more succinctly. He said, the future is not a gift, it's an achievement. I think politics is the way in which we achieve the future, or at least part of the way in which we achieve the future. And I ended up being captivated by this whole pageant. And when I was 9 years old, I started working in campaigns. I worked for Bobby Kennedy, as a matter of fact, when he ran for the Senate in New York in 1964. I wasn't the strategist in that campaign. I was more of a field operative. And then when I was 10, I made this profound decision, and I broke with the Democratic Party, gave it a lot of thought the Democratic candidate for mayor of New York was kind of a hack. I don't know how a 10-year-old makes those judgments, but and I worked for a guy named John Lindsay, who many of you may remember, who was a liberal Republican. And if you want to know what they look like, there are a couple on display at the Field Museum just down the road there. And I worked in campaigns throughout my teenage years, including the Kennedy campaign when Bobby Kennedy ran for president in 1968, in that exhilarating and tragic campaign in a very difficult year. And when it came time to go to college, I wanted to go somewhere where the politics were interesting, and that was one of the factors that led me here to Chicago. I had 3 factors. One was I wanted to go to an excellent university, and the University of Chicago was an excellent university. My homeroom teacher gave me very sage advice that I should choose a school at least 600 miles from New York so my parents wouldn't surprise me with a visit. That made sense to me when I was 17. But I really was interested in going to a place with vital politics, and of course Chicago had been home to the 1968 Democratic National Convention, the cataclysmic convention, a major event in our history. It was still a home to the last of the big city machines. Richard J. Daley was still alive and active at the time, and it also was a place where there was this burgeoning black independent political movement. The University of Chicago was situated right in the middle of it. And all of that interested me, and I went to the University of Chicago, and it was, in fact, a great university. But the problem I had was that I was interested in politics and in the world, and I couldn't find anybody there at that time who wanted to talk about anything that happened after the year 1800. And so to sate my interest in politics, I started writing for local newspapers. I conned my way into a job at the Hyde Park Herald newspaper as a local political columnist. In fact, I went back the other day and looked at my first column. I wrote about it in the book, and the column was on the police brutality, the relationship between police and the African American community. So thank God that's in the past. And I got a job at the end of it after I passed my swimming test at the Chicago Tribune, which is where I met Dick. I got an internship and parlayed that into a full-time job. And the editor there, a fellow named Bernie Judge, who some of you may know, the city editor who hired me, said, you know more about local politics than anybody I have. You know all the aldermen and ward committeemen, all the Byzantine history of all the 50 wards. But he said, but you don't know how to be a reporter yet, so I'm putting you on nights. So I spent 2.5 years covering murder and mayhem, which actually turned out to be good preparation for Chicago politics. And they used to take me off nights and give me an opportunity to cover campaigns for a couple of weeks every year. And they always put me on the candidate who was a sure loser because they wanted to save the good candidates for the real political reporters. And so in 1979, they said, well, this woman, Jane Byrne, is running for mayor. She's not going anywhere, but, why don't you take a few months off and cover that campaign? And of course, you all know the history of that election. And when she won, they made a place for me on the political desk. I ultimately became the City Hall bureau chief and a political writer and a columnist for the paper at a time that was really, just so interesting for our city, the emergence of Harold Washington and the very vituperative, acrimonious years of council wars and so on. So it was a wonderful, wonderful beat and a great experience. But I could see journalism was changing. Dick will remember we had a change of management at the Tribune at the time that in the early 80s. And we went from this kind of roaring, kind of front page newsroom where the story was everything to more of a contemporary setup where the bottom line became much more important. We had changes of editors, and the people who hired me were dispatched, and we had a new group that had a different philosophy than mine. And along that time, a fellow who many of you in this room knew, and probably some of you really loved, as I did, Paul Simon came along, the politician, not the singer, or as he called himself relative to the other Paul Simon, Big Paul Simon. But Paul was on me for some time. He was running for the Senate against Charles Percy. Chuck Percy, many of you remember him as well, was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee at the time. And it was a big national race. And Paul wanted me to come and work for him. And I thought long and hard about it, and I had a great career, but I thought if I was going to make the switch, this was the kind of guy I wanted to work for. Paul was a thoroughly authentic person. You all remember him, the Orville Redenbacher of Illinois politics with the big horn-rimmed glasses, his big ears. We used to joke about Paul Simon's plan for global domination. But Paul was a believer. Paul saw public life as a calling. Paul ran for office. He bought a newspaper when he was 19 years old in southern Illinois, used it to crusade against a crime syndicate down there. When he couldn't get anybody to run against them for the offices that they dominated, he ran for the legislature. I think he was 23 years old or something, and he, in the 1950s, went to the legislature where he proceeded to fight for civil rights. Now, his district was closer to Little Rock than Chicago, and it took extraordinary courage for him to do that. And he fought for political reform in the Illinois legislature, which still isn't that easy. But in the 1950s was a death-defying act as well. And so I knew that Paul would never embarrass me. I knew that I'd always be proud of him, and I made the switch, and I ended up, I went over as communications director and ended up as the campaign manager, and we won a race in the midst of the Reagan landslide of 1984. I was off, and I started my consultancy after that, doing message and strategy for campaigns, including Paul's campaign for president. One thing that I went back and looked at when I was writing the book, the ads that I did for Paul, and one of the tagline on the ads I did for Paul was "Isn't it time to believe again?" So there's this current that runs through my life, and Paul was very much a part of that. And I did 150 campaigns over the course of my consulting career, but I had a kind of crisis in the early 2000s when an old client of mine, who you also probably know, named Rod Blagojevich, ran for governor. Now, I worked for Rod when he ran for Congress. I liked him. I thought he was a pugnacious guy who cared about, the neighborhoods. But when he came to me and said he wanted to run for governor, I had some profound doubts about that. And I said, well, why do you want to be governor? And he said, well, you can help me figure that out. And I said, well, if I have to help you figure it out, you really shouldn't run. And that was the end of our relationship. I left, and that was the end of our relationship. But now it's the summer it would have been the summer of 2002. He was nominated, and now it was clear that he was going to be elected. He was running circles around the Republican candidate, the Attorney General Ryan, not the Governor Ryan, who was running at the time. Very decent guy, but he was like Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd. And Rod was, he was using all the state-of-the-art techniques of polling and everything to be the candidate that needed to win, including running as a reformer, which seems ironic now. But as you remember, our former governor, Ryan, was also on his way to prison, so it seemed like a timely message to be a reformer. So I thought at that time, maybe this business has just gotten too cynical for me, and I should think about doing something else. And just about that time, I got a call from an old friend, Barack Obama, to tell me that he was thinking of running for the Senate. And Barack was going through an existential crisis of his own because in 2000 he had run for Congress against Bobby Rush and lost narrowly by 30 points. And so he said, I told Michelle, I promised her that I had one race left in me, and if it didn't work, then I'd have to go out. I'll go out and make a living, But I'm taking a look at this U.S. Senate race. We had a Republican senator at the time. You may remember Peter Fitzgerald, and he looked vulnerable. And it was going to be a presidential year in which the Democratic vote would be very high in Illinois. So Barack was looking at it, but so were a lot of other Democrats, and he was not a highly ranked. He was highly regarded, but not highly ranked as a candidate because he had just lost. He didn't have any money. He was named Barack Obama, and this was 1 year after someone named Osama bin Laden had bombed had destroyed the World Trade Center, and so the name itself seemed, potentially a barrier. African American guy from Chicago, and so on. But I thought to myself, I knew Barack. I knew him well. In 1992, Betty Lou Saltzman, who some of you know, doyen of liberal politics around here for a long time, called me and said, I just met this most remarkable young man, just came back from Harvard Law School to run Project Vote, a voter registration. I think you ought to meet him. I said, I'm happy to meet anybody you want to meet, but why? And she said, I think he could be the first African-American president of the United States. This was 1992. He was 31, I guess. So needless to say, whenever I go to the track now, I take Betty Lou with me. So I went and had lunch with Barack, and while I didn't, as I said in the book, walk away humming "Hail to the Chief," I knew that he was a remarkable guy, and Senator Udall can speak to this. He's on the right side of this equation, but politics basically divides into two categories. There is the larger category of people who run for office because they want to be something, and then there's the smaller and more admirable group of people who run for office because they want to do something, who see politics as a calling and not as an avenue to celebrity or as a business. And here was a guy, Obama, who had just come back from Harvard Law School, where he had been president of the Harvard Law Review, could have written his ticket at any law firm or corporation in America and been set for life. And instead, he came back here to organize a voter registration drive and to work at a small civil rights practice. And I thought, his values were my values. And so I, when the Senate race came up, I had doubts about it at first, about his viability. I had offers from other candidates, but I told my wife, Susan, that if I could help Barack get elected to the U.S. Senate, that would be something I could be proud of for the rest of my life. So I went to work for him, and we went about the business of trying to persuade a very skeptical political community that he could get elected. And as many of you were here at that time, that race itself was kind of a magical race. It was a forerunner to what we saw in 2008. But I learned a lot about him in that race, and there were three principal things I learned. One was I learned just how smart he was and how prescient. And one of the first reflections of that was early in our association in the fall of 2002, the Senate was considering the resolution authorizing action in Iraq. And Barack got a call from the same Betty Lou who said, we're having a rally at the federal building against the war resolution, and we'd like you to speak. Now, almost every other candidate had endorsed, Republican and Democrat, this war resolution. As you remember, it was very popular at the time. And we had a discussion, and there were voices for and against him going. And finally he said, look, I just think this is a bad idea. And so I think I should go, and I think I should speak. And, I didn't honestly think much of the event, about the event, because it was small. I didn't think it would be well covered. I didn't pay much attention to what he was going to say. It was only after the fact that I recovered his speech, which is now available also on Google. And I don't work for Google, I want to make clear. There are other search engines that will yield the same speech, I'm sure. But he said in that speech that he wasn't against all war because some war was necessary, but he said, I'm just against dumb war. He said, what worries me here is this is going to be an engagement of unintended, unknowable cost, length, and consequences. He said, my fear is that we're going to unleash sectarianism in that part of the world, and we're going to make America the fulcrum of extremism. And all of those things, sadly, came to pass. We're still dealing with the ramifications of it today. The second thing I learned about Barack in that 2004 campaign was it came when we sent him downstate to deep southern Illinois to campaign, and he was campaigning in a veterans hall in a small town down there. And I got a call from the young man who was traveling with him, and he said, well, we had a really good day. And I'm like shocked. And I said, really? He said, yeah, well, he got a great response. And I expressed my surprise to Barack because he'd call me at night. And he said, why are you so surprised? And I said, I don't know, a black guy from Chicago named Barack Obama, I thought it could be challenging, down there. He said, no, you don't understand. He said, these people are just like my grandparents from Kansas. I'd get to talking about my grandfather who marched in Patton's army and my grandmother who was a Rosie the Riveter, and we have a really good time. And I realized at that moment that this was a guy who felt comfortable in any room in which he walked. He felt comfortable in a veterans hall in southern Illinois, and he felt comfortable in an inner city church in Chicago, and he felt comfortable in a Tony parlor in the suburbs. And that ease with people, that ability to cross those lines was a great gift, and one that would play well in a country that was so tired of being riven by our divisions. And the third thing I learned was how gifted he was as a speechwriter and as a speaker. And we had quietly lobbied after he won the nomination to get him the role as a keynote speaker at the Democratic Convention. When the call finally came through, we were driving around in southern Illinois, and Barack hung up the phone and said, I know exactly what I want to say. And I said, really, what? And he said, I want to talk about my story as part of the larger American story. And in the next few weeks, as he was driving around Illinois campaigning and casting votes in the state Senate, he would write parts of this speech out on pieces of paper. He'd go into the men's room between votes at the state senate and scribble there. And he finally pulled it all together. My wife and I were on vacation for a week, and he sent to my office, it came, I think, in the middle of the night, which is usually when his speeches arrive, a draft, and they faxed it to me. I was overseas, and I read the first page and handed it to my wife and read the second. By the third page, I thought, this is going to be one of the great convention speeches of all time. And when he finally gave it, I was standing on the floor of the convention, the Fleet Center, and the Fleet Center, right? Isn't that what they call it? In Boston. And I was standing with Robert Gibbs, our press secretary, and I saw the way people were reacting to this speech. I said to Robert, this guy's life just changed forever, and maybe our lives changed forever too. Have changed forever too. And the reason I felt that way was because I was in the hall in 1984 when Mario Cuomo made his speech in San Francisco, and I saw him immediately transformed overnight into a national political figure. But we didn't, even after he got elected to the Senate, we really didn't expect that he'd be a candidate for president in 2008. And while there were things that we did that clearly added momentum to that, that wasn't the plan or the idea. And it was only in late 2006 that we really confronted the fact that yes, this is doable. Yes, this is possible. And I remember talking to him at that time and saying, if we do this, we've got to try and recreate the sort of idealism and energy of that Bobby Kennedy campaign from 40 years ago. He was too young to remember it, of course, but and I talked about rekindling a sense of idealism and possibility. And I'm not going to rehearse the whole campaign here. Everybody was around. Everybody's familiar with it. Happy to answer questions about it. I wrote about it extensively in the book. But I want to fast forward ahead to the end of that campaign, when it was clear that we were going to win. Everywhere we went, there were these huge crowds. Sometimes 80,000 people. And at one of these, as we drove up, he looked out the window and said, it's going to be impossible to meet all these expectations. And at that time, we knew, and Tim remembers well, that Lehman Brothers had collapsed, and the economy was kind of cascading down, and that we were going to be confronted with a great crisis. And in fact, just a few blocks from here, on December 16th, 2008, we had a meeting with the financial team, the first meeting with the president's financial team, economic team, and senior advisors and the vice president-elect and so on. And I'll never forget that meeting. Christy Romer, who was coming in as head of the Council of Economic Advisors, spoke first, and she was an expert on the Great Depression, and she had a bunch of charts. And the bottom line was, she said, Mr. President, by the way, this is the first time I heard everybody calling him Mr. President, which was kind of an adjustment for me. But she said, I think this is going to be the deepest recession since the Great Depression. Larry Summers spoke and said, there's going to be a huge hole in output in the economy, and we're going to lose millions more jobs before this is done. And he said, and candidly, I think there's a 1 in 3 chance of a second Great Depression. Tim Geithner spoke next, the incoming Treasury Secretary. He said the banks were locked up and they're not lending, and he said, and they could collapse. And then to cheer everybody up, the budget director, Peter Orszag, spoke last and said this is going to add, between what we're going to have to do to deal with this and the lost revenues, we're going to see trillions of dollars more added to the debt, and the deficits are going to be hard to tame. So at this point, Obama said, well, I guess it's too late to ask for a recount. And he said, so I guess we'd better figure out what we're going to do. And in the next 4 hours, the spine of the Recovery Act really came into being. And I watched, and that was our introduction to what was in front of us. And there were others as well, in addition to an economic crisis, and all of you are interested in foreign policy. I mean, we had 2 wars raging in Afghanistan, no real strategy. I got there was another sort of what you'd call welcome to the NBA moment the night before the inauguration. I was out with Joel Benenson, our pollster, and I got a call from Rahm Emanuel, who was coming in as our chief of staff. He said, call me on a hard line. And I called him and he said, I've been with Chertoff and the Homeland Security people all day. He said, and there's a credible threat on the inauguration. We're worried about these kids who had gone out of the country from Minneapolis and slipped back in, Somali American kids. And we can't find them, and there's some fear based on chatter that they're headed for Washington. And he said, I need you to write a 60-second speech for the president that he can give if he has to disperse the inaugural ceremonies, asking people to leave in an orderly fashion and follow direction. So, and he said, you can't tell anybody, not your wife, not your family. He said, I can't read in the speechwriters because they're not sufficiently senior. And so that night, I had a new apartment in Washington. My wife and one of my sons was there, and I just lay awake all night listening to sirens, wondering if this was related somehow. And when I woke up in the morning, I was supposed to go do television, and my wife and son were going to church services with the Bushes and the Obamas, and I so wanted to tell them not to go. I was so fearful that something was going to happen and that I would never forgive myself for not telling them not to go. But I was bound not to tell them, and thank God nothing did happen, and the president didn't have to give those remarks. But it was a reminder of the gravity of the responsibilities that we were about to assume. And over the course of the next 2 years in which I worked there, and particularly those first 6 months, I watched him make a series of decisions to save the American economy, each of which was as unpopular as they were necessary. The Recovery Act, which added in the short term to deficits at a time when the country was very concerned about them. The actions he took to buttress the financial system at a time when there was rage toward irresponsibility on Wall Street. And then the steps he took to save the American auto industry, which seem like a no-brainer now. I just saw the other day that GM is the number one in car sales, and I think Chrysler was fourth. But at that time, they were teetering on the brink of extinction, and he took a great risk there. But all these decisions were hard, and he made them unflinchingly because he thought that's what our responsibilities required. The other decision that he made in that period, in that early period, obviously, and I write extensively in the book, not extensively, but there's a chapter on the deliberations about Afghanistan and how he made that decision and the interesting interplay between the commander-in-chief and the military, which you could write volumes on, but struck me as very interesting. And I wrote about traveling with him around the world and his meetings with King Abdullah and with Mubarak and his speech in Cairo. I wrote about the relationship between Obama and Medvedev, which was actually, Ivo can remember, quite positive and constructive, and the difference between his meetings back then with Medvedev and his meeting with Putin. So there's plenty there for those who are interested. But I just want to finish with one story, which is about healthcare, because that was a fateful decision, one for which he'll be remembered for the rest of time. And I have to confess, I was on the other side of that. My job was to advise him on politics, and I thought the politics of doing healthcare was very tough. 7 presidents had tried, 7 presidents had failed. I was fluent in all the polling because it had been an issue in the campaign. And we were in the midst of all these other issues. And he said, I understand all that. He said, but if we don't get it done in the first 2 years, we'll never get it done. And this system will continue. We'll still have near double-digit inflation. We'll have millions more people each year uninsured. Ultimately, the government will implode, businesses and families, because of the cost of health care. He said, what are we supposed to do, put our approval rating on the shelf and admire it for 8 years? Or are we supposed to draw down on it in order to do something for the country? And I, even as I was arguing the other side, I so admired him for that, because basically, and he ultimately was explicit about it, he said, I'd rather risk everything than turn my back on something that I think is our responsibility. And I always say I like him so much because he listened to me so little. And throughout that whole process, and Senator Udall will remember, it was a difficult process. There were many people urging him to desist, to take something smaller, incremental. And I remember meeting in the Oval Office, a bunch of us, and Phil Shalero, his legislative director, was there when one of these discussions took place. And the president said, Phil, what do you think the chances of passing this bill are? And he said, depends how lucky you feel, Mr. President, which isn't necessarily what you want to hear from your legislative director. But Obama said, Phil, I'm a black guy named Barack Obama, and I'm President of the United States. He said, I feel lucky every day. But I went into his office in the summer, and I showed him polling data, and I said, I wasn't trying to get it. Once he made the decision, I was all in. But I said, we're taking on water. And he said, I know, but I just got back from Wisconsin, and I met a woman in Green Bay, 36 years old. She has 2 children. She's married. She and her husband both have jobs. They have insurance, but now they've hit their lifetime caps. And she's got stage 4 breast cancer. And she's worried that she's going to die and leave her family bankrupt. And by now, I was standing in the middle of the Oval Office. I felt his hand in the small of my back kind of guiding me out. We got to the door, and he said, that's not the country we believe in, so let's just keep on fighting. So fast forward ahead to the day in March of the next year when the House finally passed the bill. Senate had passed it earlier. After a lot of ups and downs that many are familiar with and don't need to be recovered here, but we were standing in the Roosevelt Room, which is the conference room that's adjacent to the Oval Office, and my office was right next to his office. President, the vice president, senior staff, and everyone who had worked on the issue, we were watching the votes come in. And as the votes came in, I found myself sort of involuntarily get up and go to my office and close the door. And I started weeping, and I mean not just little sniffles, but big sobs. And I was kind of quizzing myself as to why. And I should have said at the start of this story, I mean, I knew the healthcare system very, very well, because I have a child named Lauren. She's almost 34 now, but when she was 7 months old, my wife found her blue and limp in her crib, and we thought she had died. And we rushed to the hospital, and we saw her have a grand mal seizure. And they said, well, this is probably a transient thing. She had a cold and a fever. It's probably related to that. And a month later, they released us, and she was still having 10 seizures a day. And for the next 19 years, we couldn't control her seizures, and they did terrible damage to her. And she went through, draconian diets, 20 different medications. Some made her fat, some made her thin, some made her psychotic. She had a brain surgery that was unsuccessful. She had an implant. And back then in the day, we were paying out of pocket when I was a young reporter. I wasn't getting the big dollars that Dick Longworth was getting. I was probably making $38,000, $40,000 a year, and I was paying $10,000 a year out of pocket for Lauren's medications because insurance didn't cover it. There's a lot of other stuff insurance didn't cover. And we were among those Americans who almost went bankrupt. So I realized as I was sitting there that I was crying because I realized that other families, as a result of what the president had done and what we had done to help them, would not have to go through what we went through. And that meant a lot to me. And I went and I found him and I said, Mr. President, I want to thank you on behalf of all of those families who won't have to go through what my family went through. And he's a good friend. He lived some of that with me. So he knew what my family had gone through. And he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, well, that's why we do the work. And that one statement to me encapsulated what I think politics and public service is all about. That's why we do the work. We do a work to try and make a meaningful difference in the lives of people, in the lives of our country. And it's a great honor to have that opportunity to make that kind of difference. So I understand the great cynicism about politics today. I share the great frustrations that people have about it. But I've also seen it work and over these 40 years in ways that have moved our country forward. And, on that score, I think about that wonderful woman who took me out to see John F. Kennedy when I was 5 years old. When she came up from South Carolina, people were getting, who wanted to vote, did so on threat of death and rarely were successful. And America was an entirely different place. I was on the Daily Show with Jon Stewart, in fact, the day that he announced that he was leaving, and I talking about this book, and I mentioned this, and I said, I often wonder what she would think if she knew that the little boy she put on the mailbox wound up working for the first African-American president of the United States. And without skipping a beat, he said, I'm sure she'd be very disappointed. Which is why, of course, we're going to miss him. But that fact alone speaks to that we make progress as a country, and we do it through this messy business we call democracy, and it is a very, very worthy pursuit. And that's why I started the Institute of Politics, because I want these very public-spirited young people to believe that this is a valid way to make change. Because we can't turn our heads. I tell them all the time, Congress is going to meet with you or without you. And if you're going to live in a democracy, there are responsibilities associated with that, and you got to grab the wheel here, whichever way you want to turn it, by the way. But I mean, that's part of what the argument is about. That's part of what the debate is about. So anyway, that's why I wrote this book, and why I appreciate the opportunity to speak with all of you today, and I'm happy to handle any questions that you have.
Thank you very much, David. We'd now like to go out to the audience for a question. If you could raise your arm, wait for the mic, and make sure your question's a question and a good one, because we're on short time. Right there, the gentleman with the yellow tie.
Hi, David.
Hey.
It was many years ago when I was a TA for you at Northwestern, and I remember you talking to the class about the power of authenticity. Can you look forward to the 2016 elections and sort of comment on the impact of authenticity in the coming presidential race?
Well, authenticity, I think, is a leading indicator. If you look at the last elections, whatever your politics are, I think you look at Bush versus Gore, and Al Gore's a friend of mine. Bush versus Kerry. Kerry's a friend of mine. John McCain had to make a kind of Faustian bargain with the right in order to be the nominee, and was clearly uncomfortable with that. Mitt Romney, you look at Bush and Obama versus all those candidates, and the authentic candidate wins. Because I think people want to know that the president is comfortable in their own skin, that whatever it is he believes, that he believes it authentically, and that it flows from who he or she is. And I think that test is going to continue to be applied. And what the I think, I suspect there was a nub of an idea in there beyond just the question when you asked it, because the question gets asked a lot about Hillary, because for all her prodigious strengths, this isn't always noted as one of them because she's terribly cautious and unrevealing. And one of the lessons that I learned from the 2007-2008 campaign, I saw her as an opponent, and in 2007 she was kind of imprisoned in this cloak of inevitability, carried it around with her. It was very cautious, unrevealing, and then Obama won the Iowa caucuses, and Hillary became a different candidate. She threw caution away. Her vulnerabilities were much more evident, and she was more open about them. She was much more connecting with people, and I think a much more authentic candidate. And I think the challenge for her is going to be that candidate again in 2016, and not the candidate imprisoned by the presumption of inevitability. On the Republican side, I don't know what's going to happen. The thing, I was talking to my friend Genevieve down here, who's much more expert on Republican politics than I am, but the thing I know about presidential politics is you don't really know anything until there's a campaign, because presidential campaigns are gauntlets, they're tests. And how people react to different challenges along the way is how Americans come to know who they are. And I don't know how all these candidates are going to handle the challenges that come their way. Now's the easy part. Now's like the swimsuit competition. But when you get into the talent rounds, it gets more difficult. So we'll I know you're all thinking about Chris Christie in a swimsuit.
Next question. Right here, please, in the front row. The mic's next to you, sir.
If you were advising the governor of Illinois and the mayor of Chicago as to how to dig out of the financial problems that both the state of Illinois and the city of Chicago have, what advice would you give them? I would say don't be ideological, because I think this should not be a vehicle by which to achieve one's political goals. If, for example, your goal is to destroy public employee unions, and it's also not a problem that's going to be solved without hard decisions where everybody has to sacrifice. And so I think both of them are going to have to bend here. We need new revenues. There's going to have to be sacrifice on the part of public employees. Here's my concern about it. Illinois already has, I think, a shameful record in terms of support for public education by the state. That's why we have such pressure on property taxes. We are almost dead last in our support of human services, down with the Alabamas and Mississippis. And so I worry that we don't have a lot of room here. And we have to make hard decisions. How do we fund those things that are absolutely essential, and what do you believe is essential? And I just hope that we approach it that way and set aside our ideological agendas, whether it's undying support for public employee unions. And by the way, public employees have been ill-served in this state by politicians of both parties and by union leaders who have all agreed in an unholy alliance over a period of decades to labor agreements that there was no money to support. And so we've got to stop playing those games and get realistic about how we solve this problem, and do it with some humanity and some view that it's not just the level of taxes that determines what kind of state you are, but also the level of education, the level of human services. I think we have to find that balance.
Yes, time for one more question. Yes, the woman right there, everybody. Please. Thank you.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you.
When will that 5-year-old idealist little boy run for office?
Boy, am I glad my wife's not here. She'd come and she'd grab you right by the throat. First of all, I think it takes great courage to run for public office, and my hat's off to those who do it, because you expose yourself, and Senator Udall saw the hard edge of that in his own campaign. You have to have a strong makeup to do it.
And I'm not saying I would or wouldn't have that, but I also lost a lot of my life time with my wife and my other sons and my family, not just because, and I write in my book, I made them sacrifice to my career, and I regret that. I think I was so focused on doing what I was doing, and I missed, and especially when my daughter was sick, a lot of the responsibility fell on my wife. I feel terrible about that. But I still have some life left, and I want to spend more time with my family. And we just had our first grandchild, who's 6 months old, whose pictures are available for anyone who wants them. And so I feel like I owe it to myself and to them and you can't do that in public life. It's a great, great sacrifice, and your family bears the brunt of it. So I appreciate the question. It's a flattering question, but that's the answer.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking David Axelrod.